Hello, dear wanderers. Tonight, we follow the sigh of the northern breeze across steppes where the horizon bleeds gold into dusk, tracing the ancient paths whispered into the earth by hooves that once thundered beneath the same watchful stars that now guard your dreams. Long before inked scrolls recorded the legacies of kings and conquerors, and long before vast empires etched borders across the European continent, there existed a people whose essence flowed quietly through valleys and across mountains, like the soft breath of dawn upon the land. These were the Celts, a rich mosaic of tribal cultures and mythic traditions, their origins cloaked in the soft veil of prehistory. In gentle valleys, where rivers meandered through ancient woodlands, they emerged, not suddenly, like a storm crashing over the land, but gradually, like fog seeping through a forest at sunrise. The true cradle of the Celtic peoples remains a source of debate among scholars. Some theories place their roots in the Hallstatt culture of Central Europe around 1200 BCE, while others trace them to the Atlantic fringe as early as 3000 BCE. Their emergence was quiet, like first light spilling across dew-drenched grass, humble, yet destined to echo through time. Small clusters of humanity took root near rivers and lakes, building lives in harmony with the cycles of earth and sky. They were hunters, farmers, artisans, and storytellers. Their knowledge of nature was profound, not taught through books, but lived, shaped by seasons, soil, and stars. These early Celts expanded gently outward from Central Europe, perhaps from the upper Danube in what is now Austria, carving out lives where river spirits whispered and forest guardians stood watch. Their homes were modest, circular huts with thatched roofs that braced against rain and wind, hearths glowing with warmth and memory. Over time, like tributaries merging into a river, these scattered communities began to feel a shared pulse. Yet they never called themselves one people. They were not an empire or a nation, but a constellation of kin, united by language roots, sacred rites, and artful expression. They were many sparks in a great fire, not a single blaze. By the 8th century BCE, a distinct Celtic cultural tradition had blossomed, what archaeologists now name the Hallstatt culture, discovered in the salt-rich regions of Austria. Here, the Celts found prosperity in salt, a precious preservative and trade good. They forged bronze and iron into tools and weapons, shaped clay into practical vessels, and adorned their lives with artistic elegance. Villages grew into trade hubs. Chiefs rose among them, not just for strength, but for the treasures they possessed. Fine swords, exotic ornaments, and tombs fit for legends. Over 1,300 graves discovered at Hallstatt reveal a society rich in craftsmanship. Bronze cauldrons, iron blades, amber jewelry, golden circlets, each item a story, a status symbol, and a spiritual artifact. Yet as their skills evolved, the Celts remained deeply entwined with the living world around them. They did not see rivers and mountains as mere resources, but as sacred places where gods dwelled. Springs were not just water, they were gateways. Groves were not just trees, they were cathedrals of leaf and silence. Their spirituality flowed through land and sky, and their worldview reflected this seamless unity. They believed life and death danced in a circle, intertwined, like seasons or moon phases. The seen and unseen worlds lay close, separated only by thin veils that shifted in twilight or between breaths. Though tribes held firm to their own leaders and lands, Boy, Helvetii, Arverni, Carnudes, and many more, they shared a quiet kinship, not through conquest, but through custom. They were many names with a single heartbeat, each tribe rooted in place, yet reaching towards shared myths and rites. And then, in the 5th century BCE, a great shift began. A cultural evolution stirred, giving birth to what we now call the Latin culture, a golden age of Celtic creativity that rippled across Europe. At Lake Neuchâtel in modern Switzerland, thousands of iron offerings were cast into the water. Swords, tools, ornaments, all sleeping beneath the surface until their rediscovery in 1857. Those objects, still and silent for centuries, mark the moment when the Celtic world stretched its arms wide. Expansion became expression. Their artistic soul flourished. The mist that had crept through Europe now shimmered with colour and form. Change was in the air, carried like pollen on the wind, drifting from tribe to tribe, valley to valley. A civilization was blooming, not by empire, but by influence. The Celtic world was awakening, stirred by rhythms as old as stone, within the vast and ancient forests of Europe, where towering oaks and whispering yews formed green temples untouched by time. The Celtic peoples found both shelter and meaning. These dense woodlands, alive with birdsong and the rustling of leaves, offered more than food or fuel. They provided sacred space. The Celts were known as the people of the oak, a title that held both reverence and identity. Their spiritual leaders, the druids, drew their name from the same linguistic root, meaning oak knowers, or those with oak wisdom. These trees were not merely timber, they were symbols of life, knowledge, and divine presence. Celtic life unfolded in harmony with nature's rhythms. Each morning began with the hiss of rising smoke from hearth fires, the clatter of water buckets dipped into cool streams, and the soft lowing of cattle herded into fields. Their homes were round, made from wattle and daub or timber, with tall thatched roofs designed to shed rain and snow. At the centre of each home, the hearth fire crackled, a living presence that provided warmth, nourishment, and light in the long winters. It was the heart of the household, where meals were prepared and stories told, where ancestors were honoured, and where the day began and ended. They were skilled agriculturalists who read the land like a familiar book. Their iron ploughs cut deep into the earth, pulled by oxen bred for patience and strength. Barley, oats, rye, and wheat grew in tidy fields marked by invisible borders everyone respected. They raised animals with care, cows for milk and cheese, sheep for wool, pigs for meat, and horses for labour and speed. These animals were not just livestock, they were part of the family rhythm, their needs and moods well known and gently tended. The Celts gathered their sustenance from both cultivated land and the bounty of the wild. Forests yielded berries, nuts, mushrooms, wild game, and medicinal plants. Honey sweetened their food, and roots and herbs cured their ailments. Generations passed down the wisdom of which plants healed and which harmed, embedding knowledge into tradition. Nothing was wasted. Hides became leather, wool became fabric, antlers turned into combs and tools. Clay from riverbanks, shaped by hand and fire, became the pots and jars that held meals and memories. Celtic craftspeople were among the finest in Europe. Blacksmiths shaped iron into tools and weapons with remarkable finesse. Jewelers moulded torques, those gleaming neck rings of bronze, silver, or gold, with precise and elegant curves. Woodworkers carved intricate designs into chairs, bowls, and chests, while potters formed symmetrical vessels that were as beautiful as they were functional. Their art wasn't merely decorative, it was symbolic. Spirals, interlaces, and Triskelion motifs weren't just patterns. They carried spiritual significance, mapping the flow of energy, the cycle of life, and the interconnection of realms. Their metalwork remains among their most celebrated legacies. the swirling, fluid designs of Latin artistry, named after the Swiss site where countless artifacts were uncovered, are masterpieces of visual rhythm. Stylized animals, curling vines and flowing lines, decorated shields, sword hilts, and jewelry, dancing across the surfaces in a way that suggested movement, breath, and power. These patterns weren't static. They pulsed with the essence of life and transformation. In their society, roles were clear yet flexible, grounded in a communal ethos. At the top stood tribal kings or chieftains, leaders who commanded respect through wisdom, battle skill, and spiritual favor. Warriors formed a noble class, adorned with decorated weapons and often mounted on horses, their prestige earned through courage and loyalty. Druids stood apart, priests, judges, healers, and scholars all in one. Their education was long and rigorous, sometimes lasting 20 years, and entirely oral. They memorized laws, myths, genealogies, and philosophies, preserving the soul of their people without writing a single word. Bards held a sacred place in Celtic culture. They were not simply musicians or entertainers, but the keepers of memory. Through poetry and song, they recorded history, celebrated heroes, and shamed cowards. Their words could inspire armies or settle feuds. At feasts and festivals, their performances brought the tribe together, reaffirming shared identity and reminding listeners of who they were and where they came from. The Celtic calendar revolved around sacred festivals that marked the turning of seasons and the thinning of the veil between worlds. Samhain, in early November, signaled the end of summer and the beginning of the darker half of the year, a time to honor ancestors and listen for whispers from beyond. Imbolc, in early February, marked the first hints of spring and celebrated Brigid, goddess of healing, inspiration, and smithcraft. Beltane, on May 1st, welcomed summer with fire and fertility rituals, while Lugnasad, in August, honored the harvest and the god Lug through games and gatherings. These were not merely religious ceremonies, they were social lifeblood. Communities scattered across the land came together. Young people met potential partners. Goods were traded. Alliances were made. Disputes were resolved. The festivals reaffirmed the tribe's continuity across generations, past, present, and future, all woven into a single moment of celebration. Family formed the foundation of Celtic society. Children were included in daily life from the start, learning by watching and doing. Elders were treasured for their memory and insight. Marriage was not just a romantic union, but a social bond, sometimes uniting clans and ending conflicts. And within this structure, Celtic women held notable status. Unlike many ancient cultures, Celtic women could own land, run businesses, and even lead warriors into battle when necessary. They were seen not as possessions, but as vital participants in communal life. Across the European landscape, from Ireland's wind-lashed cliffs to the pine-covered Alps, Celtic tribes flourished. Each region developed its own flavour of Celtic culture, shaped by climate, terrain, and interaction with neighbours. Yet through trade, travel, and tradition, they remained connected. Though distinct, they shared a recognisable kinship, a unity in diversity. The Celtic world, for all its wisdom and beauty, was not without conflict. Tribal rivalries sparked skirmishes. Elites enjoyed privileges others lacked. Warriors sometimes took enemy heads as trophies, a brutal custom, yet one that reflected a belief in the head as the seat of the soul. Still, even amid violence, the Celts prized generosity, hospitality, artistry, and spirituality. These deeper values created a cultural resonance that outlived their political power. As dusk fell upon Celtic villages, families would gather around fires. Flames flickered across faces while smoke curled into the star-studded sky. Elders told stories of gods and monsters, of heroes and haunted places. Children listened, wide-eyed and silent, absorbing not only the tales, but the meaning woven into them. A worldview rooted in reverence for nature, the cycles of life, and the quiet presence of mystery in all things. In these soft, glowing moments, Celtic culture passed from one generation to the next, not through lore or book, but through voice, firelight, and trust. A living memory, carried in rhythm and in sacred groves where towering oaks touched the heavens, in quiet valleys where the rivers whispered forgotten names to ancient stones, and upon high windswept hills where land and sky met in a silent embrace, the divine realm of the Celts resided. Their gods were not remote, unreachable figures. They were woven into every stream's curve, every branch's bend, every gust of wind that carried leaves across a forest floor. Celtic spirituality wasn't a system imposed upon nature. It flowed from it, inseparable and intuitive, a sacred thread that tied the visible world to the invisible. To the Celts, the natural world pulsed with divine life. Each river had its guardian, each mountain its soul, every bubbling spring its unseen protector. These were not abstract concepts, they were living presences, honoured through ritual, offerings, and invocation. Their sacred geography wasn't found in temples of stone, but in open skies and leafy sanctuaries. The veil between the human world and the other world, a realm of gods, spirits, and ancestors, was thin and ever-shifting. Certain places and times blurred the boundary, a cave entrance, a misty lake at dawn, or the twilight hush of Samhain. These were thresholds where one might step between worlds. Unlike faiths based on rigid texts or dogmatic hierarchies, Celtic belief remained fluid and rooted in the land. Though tribal variations existed, core themes persisted. Cycles of life and death, the sacredness of nature, and the belief that power flowed through the rhythms of the earth. The gods were many and complex. Their shapes and roles shifted from region to region, tribe to tribe. Yet they shared a reverence that echoed in stories passed down, in symbols carved into stone, and in songs murmured to the stars. Thanks to archaeology, classical writings, and the mythic tales later recorded by Christian monks, glimpses of this divine pantheon have emerged. Among the most revered was Lugh, a radiant, many-skilled deity linked to craftsmanship, light, and sovereignty. His festival, Lugnasad, celebrated each August, with competitions, markets, and rites of thanksgiving, marked the first harvest and the god's vital presence in the abundance of the earth. Lugh embodied the ideal Celtic hero, master of many arts, able to lead, build, inspire, and protect. He was not one-dimensional. He was layered, like the landscape itself. Brigid, or Brigantia in Britain, was another powerful figure, goddess of healing, poetry, and the forge. She ruled over the transformative forces of fire and inspiration. Her presence felt at sacred springs and wells where pilgrims sought renewal. Her festival, Imbolc, came in early February when the first lambs were born and the snow softened, signalling spring's silent approach. Brigid's domains, health, creativity, and craftsmanship, were all processes of change, and so she was deeply beloved. The Dagda, a grand fatherly god in Irish tradition, carried a magical cauldron that never emptied, a harp that could bend emotions, and a club that held the powers of both destruction and restoration. A being of abundance and appetite, laughter and wisdom, he represented life's full richness, its sensuality its depth, and its mysterious paradoxes. His presence was a reminder that the divine could be both fierce and nurturing, formidable and kind. Danu, the divine mother figure, was seen as the origin of all, the ancestral source from which gods and mortals alike flowed. Her name lives on in the Danube River and in tales of the Tuatha De Danann, her mythical children who later became beings of the otherworld, shapers of fate, and custodians of forgotten knowledge. Then there was Cernunnos, the horned god of wild places. Depicted on the famed Gundestrup cauldron with antlers like those of a great stag, he symbolized the untamed, the liminal, the balance between hunter and hunted. He stood as a bridge between civilization and wilderness, a guardian of animals and a spirit of primal energy. His image reminds us that the Celts did not see nature as something to conquer, but as something to respect, to harmonize with, and to protect. Epona, the horse goddess, was so revered that even the Romans adopted her into their official cults, a rare honor for a non-Roman deity. She was linked with fertility, movement between worlds, and the strength and grace of horses. Her likeness, often astride or beside a steed, embodies the deep admiration the Celts held for these animals, not merely as tools of war or transport, but as sacred beings. Celtic spiritual life centered on keeping the balance between this world and the other. Rituals and ceremonies were designed to show respect, offer gratitude, and seek guidance. Natural places, springs, rivers, forests, bogs, became sites of devotion. Offerings were placed in these waters, weapons, jewelry, and cherished belongings, not discarded, but gifted, given in hope or thanks. Such acts were not about fear, they were about reciprocity, a partnership between mortal and divine. Sacred groves, called nematon, were the true sanctuaries of the Celtic world. These forest temples, untouched by axe or plough, were spaces of mystery and awe. Roman writers like Lucan describe them with hushed reverence, noting that no bird nested there, no beast slept within. Trees were ritually adorned, their branches washed in sacred water, their trunks hung with tokens and prayers. These groves were places where the community could gather and commune with divine forces, guided by those who knew the hidden ways. The Druids were the spiritual architects of this world. Far more than priests, they were judges, healers, philosophers, and scientists. Their training was intense, up to 20 years of study, entirely oral. They were walking libraries of sacred lore, genealogy, myth, and astronomy. Because the Celts avoided writing down religious knowledge, these teachings lived only in minds, passed through voice and memory. Knowledge was not just information, it was power, guarded and transmitted with great care. Roman accounts offer the only contemporary written descriptions of the Druids, though filtered through the biases of conquerors. Julius Caesar wrote that the Druids taught the immortality of the soul, which passed after death into another body, a belief hinting at reincarnation or soul continuity. He also claimed they studied the stars, the earth, and the will of the gods, suggesting a worldview that blended cosmic understanding with daily life. Whether these reports are wholly accurate or not, they reveal a people whose spiritual life was anything but simple. The question of human sacrifice remains debated. Roman sources, perhaps exaggerating for political effect, describe the burning of criminals or war captives in massive wicker structures. Some archaeological evidence hints at ritual killings in specific contexts, such as foundation offerings or times of crisis. But it remains unclear how widespread such practices were, and many claims remain unverified. What is more certain is the Celtic veneration of the head. Across their lands, carved stone heads have been uncovered, sometimes in shrines, sometimes built into walls. The head was seen as the seat of the soul, the essence of identity. Captured enemy heads were displayed not only as trophies, but as potent spiritual relics. Ancestors' skulls might be kept close, watched over, honoured. In this tradition, the face was not just a likeness, it was a presence. The Celtic year was marked by major festivals, aligned with the cycles of nature and memory. Samhain, the most profound, came as the final leaves fell and darkness deepened. It was the time when the barrier between the worlds grew thin, when spirits walked and ancestors returned. The echoes of Samhain live on today in Halloween. Imbolc celebrated early spring, the lactation of ewes, the promise of new life, the stirring of soil beneath frost. Beltane ignited the fires of May, calling forth summer and abundance. Lugnasad honoured the harvest and the god of many skills, a feast of community and survival. Each celebration was more than a party. It was a cosmic hinge, a moment of alignment between human life and the turning wheel of the universe. These were not passive observances, but active engagements with time, spirit, and place. They reminded the Celts who they were, not just tribes or farmers or warriors, but part of a grand cycle of creation and renewal. Their otherworld was not distant or unreachable. It existed alongside the visible world, hidden in mists, across the sea, or beneath ancient hills. It was a place of beauty, mystery, and endless youth. Heroes might journey there and return transformed. Some never came back. Others brought knowledge, gifts, or warnings. These tales remind us that for the Celts, reality was layered. The world we touch was only part of the whole. As night fell over their sacred landscapes, as fires flickered and shadows danced on cave walls or tree trunks, the Celts whispered prayers not to a faraway heaven, but to the gods already near, woven into wind, stone, water, and flame. In their lives, the practical and the spiritual were one. To tend a fire was also to honour Brigid. To plant a seed was to invoke the Dagda. To sing a poem was to speak with Lu. Nothing was mundane. Everything had meaning. Though the centuries have passed, though their temples have fallen and their rites lie mostly silent, the echoes of Celtic spirituality remain, in old stories retold, in sacred wells visited with reverence, in the rhythm of festivals and the hush of a grove. The ancient voices still speak, not loudly, not in shouts, but in whispers, for those who know how to. But all golden ages carry within them the quiet promise of twilight. As the Celts flourished, weaving their culture through the forests and valleys of Europe, the world around them was shifting. To the south, Rome was no longer a fledgling city. It was becoming a storm. Its armies marched with steel discipline, and its ambitions stretched like shadows across the Mediterranean. To the east, the Germanic tribes began to stir, restless, growing, listening. And to the west, across the Whispering Sea, a new tide of explorers and invaders would one day rise. The Celtic world, once a web of tribes wrapped in myth and moss, found itself caught in the sharpening gears of history. In 390 BCE, Rome felt the tremor of change. Celtic warriors, tall, painted, their hair stiffened with lime like wild crowns, descended upon the city with the raw force of legend. They burned Rome to the ground, leaving behind not just ashes, but a scar that would throb for centuries. It wasn't simply a raid, it was a revelation. Rome, humiliated and exposed, vowed never to be defenseless again. And from that vow, an empire was born. The memory of Celtic fury haunted Roman minds like a nightmare they could not forget. So they sought to rewrite the story, not just with scrolls, but with blood and conquest. Yet for a time, the Celts still wandered. They moved east, crossing mountains and rivers, settling even in Anatolia, where they founded a land called Galatia. There, amidst the strange blend of Eastern deities and Western defiance, they forged a new identity. They were no longer raiders, but residents, no longer howling warriors, but builders of temples and keepers of treaties. Still Celtic, but softened, shaped by the lands they now called home. But even the soil could not save them. By the time Roman legions arrived, the Celts were already being absorbed, first through trade and alliance, then through sword and subjugation. Back in the West, the storm had a name: Caesar. Between 58 and 50 BCE, Julius Caesar led the Gallic Wars, a brutal, relentless campaign that swept through Gaul like fire in dry grass. Tribe by tribe, the Celts fell. Caesar did not merely defeat them, he documented their destruction in chilling detail. His commentaries on the Gallic War served as both propaganda and prophecy, a tale of inevitability written by the victor. It was strategy dressed as story, conquest masquerading as clarity. But even amid the wreckage, there was resistance. One name echoes across time: Vercingetorix. Chieftain of the Arverni, he united the fractious Gallic tribes in a rare, defiant alliance. For a heartbeat in history, hope surged. At Alesia, they made their stand, against overwhelming odds, under Roman siege. When the walls fell and the food ran dry, Vercingetorix walked from the gates and laid his sword at Caesar's feet. A symbol of dignity, of defeat, of something ancient ending. He was paraded through Rome, a trophy draped in chains, before being quietly executed. And with him, a chapter closed, not just of war, but of wildness. The Celts, fragmented and folded into Roman order, became subjects of a system they had once scorned. Yet the spirit did not die. In the hills of Scotland, in the woods of Wales, in the deep emerald of Ireland, and the windswept cliffs of Brittany, the Celtic soul slipped between the cracks of empire. Rome could pave roads and plant cities, but it could not pave over the stars. It could not silence the old songs. In these edges of the world, where Rome's grip loosened and the land remained untamed, the Celts endured. They hid not just in forests, but in folklore, in language, in the rhythm of the seasons, in dreams. The druids, once feared and hunted, found shelter in memory. Poets carried their wisdom in verse. Warriors etched ancient symbols onto blades. Even as Christianity swept in, cloaked in light and law, it absorbed rather than erased. Pagan festivals became saints' days. Sacred groves gave way to chapels, but the stones beneath still hummed with older meaning. The Celtic calendar, the solstices, the harvests, the thin times, when the veil between worlds thins, remained quietly in place, like breath beneath the surface. And perhaps this is the deeper truth of Celtic endurance. Not domination, but transformation. They did not collapse under the weight of empire. They dissolved into story. They whispered their way into the bones of Europe, into lullabies and lullings, into bedtime tales of heroes and fairies and lands that shimmer just out of sight. Where others were erased, the Celts became myth. And myth, unlike marble, does not crack with time, it ripples. So when we speak of the Celts, we do not just trace a lineage, we touch a vibration, a murmur in the land, a ghost in the green. Their power was never in permanence, but in presence, in the way they folded into the folds of history, like water into soil. They are there still, beneath the cities, beneath the cathedrals, beneath the sleep of the world. And tonight, as you close your eyes, perhaps you'll hear them. In the hush of wind on your window, in the stillness between breaths. They are not gone. They've simply changed form. They are the rhythm in your rest, the mist in your mind, the myth that cradles you to sleep. 5-5. What truly remains of the Celts is not just their history. It is something more elusive, more lingering. It's not etched in monuments or archived in textbooks, but breathed in the hush of the forest after rain, in the hush of twilight when the wind changes, in that fleeting silence between lightning and thunder. Its atmosphere, presence, a resonance that exists just beyond words. You don't read the Celts, you feel them. Long after their empires crumbled and their warriors laid down their arms, the Celtic people became something else entirely. Not rulers, but rememberers. The sword gave way to the story, and in the folds of the British Isles and beyond, bards rose where generals fell. They became the sacred librarians of a people's soul, the keepers of battles long past, and gods long worshipped. They sang not for fame, but for memory. They whispered, so the silence would not be empty. In Ireland, the myths did not sleep. They bloomed, wild and stubborn, like heather in the cracks of empire. Cu Chulainn, the Hound of Ulster, whose fury could twist his body into monstrous rage. He wasn't just a hero, he was a mirror of our own rage and honour. Fionn MacCumhall, who tasted wisdom from a salmon, he reminds us that knowledge is often found in the most unexpected sources. And the Tuatha De Danann, the radiant beings who faded into the hills, only to reappear as the fair folk. They whisper to us even now in dreams and stories and unexplained fears. These weren't bedtime tales, they were soul maps, blueprints for how to suffer, how to fight, how to endure. To grow up hearing these tales by the hearth was to be told, your world is layered, and your pain is sacred. In Wales, the same care was taken. The stories nestled in valleys and echoed from the mountains, passed from lip to ear to page. The Mabinogion holds a strange kind of truth, dream logic tales, where nothing is simple and everything is symbol. Pwyll trades places with a god. Rhiannon is wronged and waits in dignity. Bran crosses the sea with a singing head. These were not myths in the modern sense. They were teaching tools. They told children what it meant to transform, to suffer injustice, to wait with grace, and more importantly, that death was not the worst thing, that forgetting was. Brittany, across the sea, held on tightly too. Even as Rome faded, the granite cliffs and deep woods clung to the old beliefs like lichen. There, knights and fairies, sacred springs and whispering stones were not just remnants of the past. They were alive in the rhythms of the present. The Celts never drew harsh lines between the magical and the mundane. A grove could be a home or a portal. A bird might be a spirit. A sudden chill in the air might mean you're not alone. The world was not to be conquered, it was to be listened to. And this listening extended to time itself. The Celtic calendar did not tick forward like a clock. It turned like a wheel. Samhain for death and veils, Imbolc for stirring and thaw, Beltane for fire and risk, Lugnasad for gratitude and grief. These weren't holidays. They were moments in the soul's weather. And though modern life has tried to linearize everything, to turn even time into a resource, the old rhythms still beat beneath the floorboards, in Halloween bonfires, in May Day flowers, in those mornings when we feel something shift and can't explain why. Celtic art reflected this worldview perfectly. Interlaced patterns, with no clear start or end, weren't just beautiful. They were philosophies in form. Eternity, flow, interconnectedness. Their animals weren't real. They were idealized, symbolized, mythologized. Drawn not to mimic, but to evoke. A hound wasn't just a dog. It was loyalty, rage, hunger. And their monuments, too, weren't for glory. The stone circles, the burial mounds, the sacred wells, they weren't made to dominate the skyline. They were tuned, like instruments. They aligned with the sun, the moon, the turning year. They were built not to be seen, but to be felt. Even now, thousands of years later, we feel it. Not consciously, not always. But when you walk through a misty field and get the urge to speak softer, when you feel watched in a forest, and it's not fear, but reverence, when you hear an old folk tune and something in you aches without knowing why, that is the Celtic echo. It is the inheritance of presence, a form of memory that lives in the body, not the mind. And perhaps, if I may offer a thought, this is what the modern world is starving for. Not more data, not more noise, but this silent sense of wonder, this quiet confidence that the world is alive, sacred, and layered with meaning. The Celts did not demand faith. They invited attention, and in doing so, they made even the most ordinary things shimmer with possibility. So, as you lie here, eyes heavy, perhaps you'll sense them. Not as ghosts, but as impressions. Not as gods, but as glances. The Celts are not gone. They were never meant to last in the way empires do. They endure instead, like breath on glass, like a story half remembered, like a feeling you could 6-6. So here we are, standing not at the end of a tale, but at the edge of something circular, something spiraled. The story of the Celts doesn't finish. It deepens, it retreats, resurfaces, and recedes again like tide over old stones. They were never truly erased. History may have tried to close the book on them, but the pages remain open, fluttering in the wind. Their kingdoms were conquered, their druids silenced, their runes worn thin, but the essence of who they were still pulses beneath our feet. Their languages, though diminished, are not dead. They survive in lullabies and rebel songs, in poetry scrawled on cafe napkins, in the breath of those who refuse to forget. You cannot walk through the British Isles or the coastlines of Brittany without encountering that ancient presence. It's not always visible, it's not always loud, but it's there. In the twist of a path that follows no rational line, in a stone that stands for no reason except that it always has, in the way mist drapes itself over moor and mountain, asking you to be still. The Celts left behind more than names or relics. They left behind a way of sensing the world, a worldview carved not in marble, but in moss, in myth, in memory. To remember the Celts today is an act of quiet defiance. In an era that prizes speed, they offer stillness. In a culture that glorifies control, they invite surrender. In a world obsessed with mapping, measuring, and monetizing, they remind us that not all value is visible. Some truths can't be bought or proved or posted. They have to be felt. They have to be lived. And this, perhaps, is what the Celts were trying to preserve all along. Not power or territory, but presence. A full-bodied, full-hearted way of being in the world that doesn't divide the sacred from the everyday. Their spirituality wasn't about grand temples or rigid creeds. It was lived, felt in the wind, seen in the flight of birds, honored at the turning of the sun. They spoke to rivers, and sometimes the rivers spoke back. They lit fires not to destroy, but to mark transitions, to welcome and release. Their gods were not perched on clouds, judging from afar. They were near, immediate, woven into soil and storm, into hunger and harvest. And their stories, those luminous looping stories, weren't distractions from reality. They were reality, filtered through meaning. They were a way of keeping the soul fed in a world that could be, and still is, profoundly unpredictable. The modern world often treats myth as something quaint, something childish. But to the Celts, myth was a tool, a compass when maps ran out, a mirror when logic failed, a way of navigating not the outside world, but the inner one. And they understood something we forget at our peril, that you don't need to believe a story is factual for it to be true. A myth doesn't describe events. It describes essence. It tells you how it feels to grieve, to love, to fear the dark and honor the dawn. It says what your heart knows, even when your mind cannot explain it. So when we think of the Celts, let's not picture them only as warriors with painted faces and bronze swords. Let's think of them as keepers of balance, between the known and the unknowable, between body and spirit, land and law, silence and song. They were masters of thresholds, of the in-between spaces, and in that, they were not primitive. They were precise. They knew that clarity doesn't always mean truth, and mystery isn't the enemy of wisdom. It's the source of it. Even now, their fingerprints are on us. In the festivals we still celebrate, though we've changed their names. In the urge to build circles of stone or dance around fire. In the way our breath catches at twilight, or our steps slow on ancient paths. When we pause to listen, not just to words, but to wind, to water, to the quiet heartbeat beneath noise. That is their legacy. Not domination, but deep participation. Not monuments, but memories. And perhaps this is their greatest gift, the invitation to remember that we are not alone, not in time, not in spirit, not in meaning. That behind every concrete wall and glowing screen, there is still the whisper of a world more ancient and more alive than we dare imagine. A world that doesn't care if we're productive, or successful, or correct. It asks only that we notice, that we soften, that we show up fully, and see what the earth has to say. I often think about how the Celts must have viewed endings. For a people who saw time as a circle, death was never final. Loss was never empty. Every goodbye was a doorway. Every absence, a shift in presence. They didn't just grieve, they transformed. They carried their ancestors not in monuments, but in music. Not in stone markers, but in stories retold and reshaped across generations. This too is how they remain. So as you lie there, on the brink between waking and dream, perhaps you can feel them, not as ghosts, but as echoes, as gentle reminders that the world is wider than it seems, that there are roots beneath your routines, that there is a rhythm in you older than your name. You don't have to do anything, just breathe. Just be. The Celts are not gone. They have folded themselves into time, into language, into landscape, into us. Sleep now. Let their memory settle over you like mist on the mountain. Let it carry you, not to an end, but to a return to something sacred, something slow,